I built an insurance business worth over $8 million from nothing, and last Sunday my son asked me if I had ever had a real career. He said it casually, like he was asking about the weather, like it was a harmless question. He didn't even look up from his phone when he said it, and for a moment I thought maybe I had misheard him. Maybe I had imagined the quiet disrespect hidden inside such a simple sentence. But then my daughter-in-law smiled that tight, polite smile and said, "Well, she's always been good with people," and something about the way she said people made it sound small, like what I had built over 35 years could be reduced to conversations and handshakes. Not contracts and risk and long nights staring at numbers that could either feed my family or break us. I didn't say anything. I just sat there at the end of the table in the house I paid for, listening to the soft clink of silverware and the low hum of the dishwasher in the background, and I realized something that I think had been building for years. I had spent my entire life creating stability for my children, and somehow I had raised them to believe it had always been there, that it had come easy, that it had come from somewhere else. They didn't see the woman who arrived in this country at 27 with one suitcase and a borrowed coat. They didn't see the early mornings catching a bus before sunrise to clean offices downtown, or the nights I stood behind a diner counter pouring coffee for strangers who never learned my name. They didn't see the stack of rejection letters when I first tried to get licensed in insurance, or the way my hands used to shake dialing numbers from a phone book because I had no leads and no one to call me back. They didn't see the months I made nothing, not a dollar, just promises to myself that tomorrow might be different. They didn't see me studying policy language at the kitchen table after they went to sleep or falling asleep with a pen still in my hand because I was too tired to make it to bed. All they saw was the version of me that existed now, the one who wore simple clothes and drove the same car for 10 years and never talked about money. Because I thought that was how you kept a family grounded. You don't show them everything, you protect them from the weight of it, and somewhere along the way that silence turned into something else. It turned into invisibility. My son laughed a little then, not cruelly, just casually, and said, "I mean, you did okay, but it's not like you built something big, right?" And that was the moment I understood that he truly didn't know. Not about the agency, not about the contracts, not about the accounts still paying out month after month, not about the people whose lives I had helped protect, not about the fact that everything around him, the house, the education, the life he now believed he had built on his own, had started with a woman he no longer saw clearly. I picked up my glass of water and took a small sip, steady, quiet, controlled, because I had learned a long time ago that reacting in the moment gives away too much, and there was something else. Something in the way my daughter-in-law had asked earlier about my accounts, about long-term planning, about what happens next, something that didn't sit right with me, something I couldn't quite name yet, but I felt it there, beneath the surface of that dinner. Beneath the casual questions and the polite smiles, like a second conversation happening just out of reach, and as I sat there listening to them talk about their future, their plans, their ideas, I realized they had no idea what I actually owned, no idea what I controlled, and no idea how quickly that could change. I did not sleep much that night, not because of what my son said, but because of how easily he said it, like it had been sitting in his mind for years, waiting for a quiet moment to slip out, and I found myself replaying the dinner over and over again, every word, every glance, every small detail I might have ignored before. I kept thinking about the way my daughter-in-law leaned forward slightly when she asked about my accounts, about how she phrased it carefully, like someone who already knew more than she was saying. She had asked if I had considered consolidating things, making it easier for the family in the future, and at the time I had nodded politely, because that is what I have always done. I keep things calm, I keep things simple, I do not create tension where it is not necessary. But now, in the quiet of my bedroom, that question felt different. It felt intentional, like a door being tested to see if it was unlocked. I got out of bed around 5 in the morning, the same time I used to wake up years ago when I had my first cleaning job downtown, and for a moment I stood in the kitchen just listening to the silence. The house was still, everything looked the same, but something had shifted, something I could not ignore anymore. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at the table where I had once sorted bills and counted every dollar. And I realized I had not looked closely at my own accounts in a long time. Not really. I trusted the systems I had built. I trusted the people I had hired. And most of all, I trusted my family. Maybe that was my mistake. I opened my laptop slowly, almost carefully, like I already knew I might find something I did not want to see. The screen lit up and I logged into the main account for the agency. Everything looked normal at first. Numbers, reports. The usual flow of commissions and renewals, steady, predictable, the kind of stability I had spent decades building, but then I noticed a transfer I did not recognize. It was not large enough to cause alarm on its own, just a few $1,000s, labeled as an operational adjustment. I frowned slightly and clicked into the details. The authorization code was unfamiliar, not one of the managers I had personally approved. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen for a moment, telling myself there was probably a simple explanation. There is always a simple explanation. But something in my chest tightened. Not panic, not yet, just awareness. I checked another account, then another. And there it was again, small movements, spaced out, careful, almost invisible unless you were looking for them, which I had not been. Not until now. I closed my eyes for a second and took a slow breath, because I understood this kind of pattern. I had built my entire career on understanding patterns. Risk does not always come in loud, obvious ways. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as routine. I opened the authorization logs again, and this time I followed the access history, step by step, and that was when I saw his name. Not directly, not in a way that would raise immediate suspicion, but connected, linked through a secondary access point, someone who should not have been there at all. My fingers rested lightly on the keyboard, still controlled, because reacting too quickly leads to mistakes, and I have never built anything by rushing. I have always watched first, learned second, acted last. I looked around the kitchen again, the same table, the same chairs, the same quiet morning light coming through the window, and I realized something that felt heavier than anything I had thought the night before. This was not about a careless comment at dinner. This was something else entirely. Something that had been happening without my knowledge, something that required patience to understand, and I knew in that moment that I would not say a word, not yet, because whatever they thought I did not know, I intended to learn all of it before they realized I was watching. The next few days moved quietly on. The surface almost normal, and that was exactly how I wanted it. I kept my routine the same. I answered calls from the agency, reviewed reports, approved renewals, everything steady, everything controlled, because when something is wrong, the worst thing you can do is show that you have noticed too soon. I had learned that lesson years ago when I first started in this business. People reveal more when they think you are not paying attention, and I needed to see everything clearly before I made a single move. That afternoon I drove to the office, something I had not done in person for a few weeks. I usually trusted my managers to handle the day-to-day operations, but now I wanted to feel the place again, to see it with my own eyes. The building looked the same as always, clean glass doors, the small brass sign with the agency name that I had chosen myself 20 years ago. I remember standing there the first day we opened, holding that sign in my hands and wondering if anyone would walk through those doors. Now there were people inside who depended on that name, on the stability it represented, and I had protected that for decades. I walked in slowly, greeting the receptionist with a calm smile. She greeted me warmly, nothing unusual, nothing out of place, and that told me something important. Whatever was happening was not obvious, not careless. It was quiet, intentional. I went to my office and closed the door. The same office I had furnished piece by piece over the years. Not expensive, just practical. A desk that had seen thousands of contracts. A chair that had held me through countless late nights. I sat down and opened the internal system again, this time from the office network, cross-checking the entries I had seen at home, and the pattern became clearer. The transfers were spaced out carefully, never large enough to trigger alerts, always labeled in ways that blended into routine operations. But when I followed the access trails, I saw the same secondary authorization point appear again and again, and this time I traced it further, deeper into the system, until I reached a linked profile that should not have had that level of access. My son's name was not directly on it, But the connection was there, tied through an account he had once used when he said he wanted to learn more about the business. I remembered that conversation now. It had been a few years ago. He had asked questions, shown interest, and I had given him limited access, nothing critical, just enough for him to see how things worked. I had thought it was a good thing, a sign that maybe he wanted to understand what I had built. But I never followed up. I trusted that it would remain what it was meant to be. A window, not a door. I leaned back in my chair and let that memory settle, because now it looked different. Now it looked like the beginning of something I had not recognized at the time. I checked the timestamps again. The activity was recent, consistent, not accidental, and then I saw another detail that made everything even clearer. The access was often followed by logins from a second device, one that was not registered under the agency. I did not need to guess who that belonged to. I had seen my daughter-in-law using her tablet during family visits, always checking something, always just slightly too attentive when financial topics came up. I rested my hands on the desk and looked around the office. Once more, everything I had built was still there, stable, intact, but now I understood that someone had been quietly reaching into it, not enough to break it, just enough to take from it, and the realization did not make me angry, not yet. It made me focused, because this was no longer about a misunderstanding or a careless comment. This was a decision, a series of decisions made over time, and I knew exactly what that meant. I would need to be patient, I would need to see how far it went, and most importantly, I would need to make sure that when I finally acted, there would be no confusion about who had built this and who controlled it. The next step was not action, it was confirmation, because I had built my entire life on one principle: never move on assumption when you can move on certainty. I stayed in the office longer that day, not working in the usual sense, but watching, tracing, learning the rhythm of what had been happening behind my back. I opened older records, not just the recent ones, and I began to follow the pattern backward, month by month, carefully, patiently, the way I used to study policies. Line by line when I first started, and what I saw was not chaos, it was structure. The transfers had started small, almost invisible, a few $100s here, 1,000 there, always spaced far enough apart to avoid attention, and then slowly. Over time, they had grown, not dramatically, but steadily, like someone gaining confidence, like someone testing how far they could go without being noticed. I leaned forward slightly, my eyes focused on the screen, because I recognized that kind of behavior. It was not random, it was intentional. It was someone who believed they understood the system well enough to use it without consequence. I clicked into the access logs again, and this time I filtered by device activity. And there it was, the same unregistered device appearing again and again, always paired with a secondary authorization tied to my son's old credentials. I remembered the day he had asked for that access. He had been sitting at this very desk, younger, curious, asking questions about how policies worked, how commissions were calculated, and I had felt proud. I had thought maybe he wanted to follow this path, maybe he wanted to understand the life I had built for him. So I gave him a limited entry point, something safe, something controlled. I had explained it carefully, what it could do, what it could not do, and he had nodded, listening just enough to move forward, not enough to respect the boundaries behind it. I sat back slowly and let that memory settle into the present, because now it had a different meaning. Now it looked like the beginning of access that had never truly been closed. I closed the system and rested my hands on the desk, not tense, not angry, just still, because anger clouds judgment and I needed clarity more than anything else. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where employees came and went, people who trusted this business to provide stability for their own lives, and I thought about everything that depended on what I had built, not just my family, but dozens of others, and that was when the situation became even clearer to me. This was not just about money being moved quietly, it was about control being tested, about boundaries being ignored, about someone assuming that what I had created could be accessed without consequence. I returned to the desk and opened a different set of documents, the legal structure of the agency, the ownership layers, the permissions I had put in place years ago, and I reviewed them carefully. Not because I had forgotten them, but because I needed to see them again with new eyes. I needed to understand exactly how much room they had been given, and how easily that room could be taken back. I noticed something then, a small oversight, not dangerous on its own, but enough to allow limited movement if someone was patient and careful, and I understood immediately how it had been used. Not broken, not forced, just used, quietly, repeatedly, until it became routine. I closed the file and sat there for a moment in complete silence, because now I knew what had happened, and more importantly, I knew what had not happened. They had not taken control. They had only borrowed space they were never meant to occupy, and that meant something very important. It meant I still held everything that mattered. I still had the authority, the structure, the foundation, and that realization did not bring relief, it brought focus, because the next step was no longer about discovery, it was about timing. And I had never rushed timing in my life, not when building something and not when protecting it. I did not make any changes that day, not to the accounts, not to the access levels, not even to the permissions that I now knew had been quietly used, because the moment you close a door too early, the person on the other side knows you have seen them. And I was not ready for that, not yet. I left the office at the usual time, walked through the same glass doors, nodded to the same people, everything steady, everything normal, because normal is the most effective cover when you are learning the truth. That evening I received a message from my son asking if we could have dinner again later in the week. He said he wanted to talk about some future planning ideas, something about long-term stability. Something about making things easier for everyone. The words were careful, almost rehearsed, and I read them twice before setting my phone down, because now I understood what those conversations were really about. They were not about helping me. They were about positioning themselves closer to what I had built. I replied simply, of course. That sounds good, because agreeing costs nothing when you already control the outcome. The next morning I woke up early again. The same quiet routine, the same coffee. The same light coming through the kitchen window, but my focus had shifted completely. I opened my laptop and began organizing information. Not reacting, not confronting, just preparing. I created a separate file and started documenting everything I had seen, the dates, the amounts, the access points, every detail recorded clearly, because clarity is power when the time comes to act. I also reviewed the external structures connected to the agency, the holding accounts, the distribution channels, the legal protections I had put in place years ago when the business first began to grow. Back then I had been careful, almost overly careful, because I knew how quickly things could change in this country. How fragile success can be if it is not protected correctly, and now I was grateful for that version of myself, the one who had planned for risks I never thought would come from my own family. By midday I made a call to someone I had not spoken to in a while, a legal advisor who had helped me structure the business years ago. I kept the conversation simple, professional. I asked general questions about reviewing access controls and updating ownership protections, nothing urgent. Nothing alarming, just a routine check, because routine is how you move without drawing attention. He agreed to meet later that week, and I scheduled it without hesitation. After I hung up, I sat quietly for a moment, letting the silence settle around me, because this was the part of the process most people rush through, the preparation, the quiet work that happens before anything visible changes. But I had never built anything by rushing, and I was not about to start now. That evening I drove to the grocery store, picked up a few things, returned home. Everything simple, everything ordinary, and yet beneath that ordinary surface everything had shifted. I was no longer the person sitting at that dinner table, wondering if I had been misunderstood. I was the person who knew exactly what was happening and was choosing when to respond, and that difference mattered more than anything, because control is not about reacting to what others do. It is about deciding when and how the situation changes. I looked around my kitchen once more, the same table, the same chair where I had built my life piece by piece, and I understood something with complete clarity. They believed they were slowly stepping into something they did not fully understand, but I had built every inch of it, and I knew exactly how to take it back without ever raising my voice. The meeting was set for Thursday morning, a quiet office downtown that I had not visited in years, and when I walked in, everything felt familiar in the way places do when they have witnessed important decisions. The kind that do not look dramatic from the outside, but change everything underneath. My advisor greeted me with the same calm professionalism he always had. No unnecessary questions, no assumptions, just a simple nod and an invitation to sit. And that was exactly why I had chosen him all those years ago. He understood that clarity matters more than emotion when it comes to protecting what you have built. I did not rush into explanations. I never do. Instead, I laid out what I wanted reviewed: access points, authorization layers, ownership protections, everything framed as a routine reassessment, because routine is still the safest way to move when the situation is sensitive. He listened carefully, taking notes, asking only precise questions, the kind that help you see your own structure more clearly. And as we walked through the details together, I could see the shape of things tightening, not in a reactive way, but in a controlled one. We identified where permissions could be adjusted, where visibility could be restricted, where approvals could be rerouted. Small changes on paper, but significant in practice, because control is rarely about one large decision. It is about many small ones aligned in the same direction. At one point he paused and looked at me directly, not questioning, just confirming, and asked if I wanted to make these changes immediately or phase them in over time. I took a moment before answering, not because I was unsure, but because timing matters. And I had already decided that nothing would happen abruptly, nothing that would signal awareness too early, so I told him to prepare everything but not activate it yet, to structure it in a way that could be implemented quietly, in stages. Without drawing attention, he nodded once, understanding exactly what that meant. When the meeting ended, I walked out into the late morning light and stood there for a moment, letting the air settle around me, because something important had shifted, not externally. Everything still looked the same, but internally I now had a clear path forward. And more importantly, I had options. I drove back home slowly, not thinking about confrontation or explanations, because those things belong to people who act before they understand. I was thinking about sequence, about how each step would lead into the next without resistance. That afternoon my son called again, his voice relaxed, almost casual, asking if we were still on for dinner that weekend. He mentioned wanting to go over some ideas he and his wife had been discussing. Something about simplifying financial structures, making things easier to manage in the future. The words were almost identical to the message he had sent earlier in the week, and I could hear the confidence in his tone, the quiet assumption that everything was moving in the direction they expected. I agreed without hesitation. Of course, that sounds fine, because agreement at the right moment gives you more control than resistance ever will. After the call ended, I placed my phone down gently and sat in silence for a few seconds, not tense, not emotional, just aware, because now I understood the full picture. They believed they were preparing for the future. They believed they were stepping into something they could manage, something they could shape. But what they did not understand was that every structure they were planning to adjust, every account they were thinking about, every layer they assumed they could access, was something I had designed long before they ever considered it. And design gives you an advantage that cannot be seen until it is too late to change direction. I stood up and walked through the house slowly, the same house where everything had started, where every decision had been made one step at a time, and I realized that this situation was no different. It was simply another structure that needed to be corrected, not with noise, not with conflict, but with precision. And when the moment came, it would not be about proving anything. It would be about reminding them, quietly, clearly, who had built this and who still controlled every part of it. Saturday evening arrived exactly as expected, calm on the surface, carefully arranged beneath it. I drove to their house just before 6, the same time I always had, carrying a small container of food I had prepared that afternoon. Something simple, something familiar, because routine makes people comfortable, and comfortable people do not watch as closely. My son opened the door with a relaxed smile, the kind he uses when everything feels under control, and my daughter-in-law followed just behind him, welcoming, polite, attentive in a way that now felt slightly rehearsed. I stepped inside, and everything looked the same as it always had. The living room neatly arranged, the soft lighting, the quiet background music. A home that suggested stability without ever revealing where that stability came from. We sat down at the table, and the conversation began easily. Small talk at first. Work, weather, plans for the coming months. Nothing unusual, nothing that would draw attention, and I let it flow naturally, because forcing a moment too early only breaks the rhythm. Eventually, my son leaned back slightly in his chair and shifted the conversation, just as I knew he would. He started talking about long-term planning again, about how important it is to simplify things as life moves forward, about how complicated financial structures can become over time. His tone was calm, confident, like someone presenting a reasonable idea, not realizing how much I already understood. My daughter-in-law added to it gently, mentioning how families often benefit from consolidating assets, from creating smoother transitions, from reducing unnecessary layers. She spoke carefully, choosing her words with precision, and I listened without interrupting, because listening gives you more than speaking ever will. They were not asking directly. Not yet. They were building toward it, step by step, creating a sense of logic, of inevitability, and I could see the structure forming in their minds. A future where they had easier access, clearer control, a role they believed they were naturally stepping into. I took a small sip of water and nodded slightly, acknowledging their points without agreeing to anything specific, because acknowledgement keeps the conversation moving while preserving your position. My son then leaned forward, resting his hands on the table, and asked if I had ever considered bringing them more directly into the management of things, just to make everything more efficient, just to prepare for the future. He said it casually, but there was intention behind it, and I could see the expectation in his eyes. The quiet belief that this was a reasonable next step. I paused for a moment, not long enough to create tension, just enough to let the silence settle slightly, and then I answered calmly. I told him I had always believed that preparation matters, that structure matters, that everything I built was designed to last, and that I appreciated his interest, because appreciation disarms without committing. My daughter-in-law smiled at that, a small, satisfied expression, as if the conversation was moving in the direction she had anticipated. But what they did not realize was that I was not responding to their proposal. I was observing how they presented it, how confident they felt, how far they were willing to go without resistance, and that told me everything I needed to know. The rest of the dinner continued in the same calm tone, light conversation, occasional references back to planning, subtle suggestions about making things easier, all of it layered carefully, all of it designed to feel natural. And I allowed it to continue, because the more they spoke, the clearer their intentions became. By the time I stood up to leave, everything had been said without anything being decided, at least from their perspective, but for me the picture was complete. I stepped outside into the cool evening air and walked to my car slowly, not rushed, not unsettled, just steady, because now there was no uncertainty left, only timing, and I knew exactly what would happen next, not because they had told me, but because I had already prepared for it. The following week moved exactly the way I expected it to, quiet on the outside, carefully structured underneath. I met with my advisor again on Tuesday morning, and this time there was no need for general questions. Everything was specific, precise, already decided. We sat across from each other with the documents laid out neatly between us, and I reviewed each adjustment one by one. Access controls rerouted through primary authorization only, secondary permissions restricted and monitored. External devices removed from all sensitive entry points. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would trigger immediate attention, just a gradual tightening of structure that would quietly close every space that had been used without permission. He explained each step clearly, not because I did not understand it, but because clarity ensures there are no gaps left behind, and I listened carefully, confirming each change with a simple nod, because when you have built something over decades, you do not leave room for uncertainty at the moment you protect it. We agreed to implement everything in stages over the next few days, subtle adjustments layered one over the other, so that from the outside nothing would appear to change all at once. And that was important, because awareness shifts behavior. and I needed behavior to remain exactly as it had been. After the meeting, I drove home slowly, not thinking about confrontation, not thinking about explanation, just thinking about sequence, because this was no longer about discovery or preparation, it was about execution. That evening I received another message, this time from my daughter-in-law. She thanked me again for being open to their ideas and mentioned that she had started outlining some ways to simplify things moving forward. Her words were polite, confident, already moving ahead as if the outcome had been agreed upon. And I read it carefully before replying with a short message that sounds thoughtful. We can talk more soon, because agreement without commitment keeps control exactly where it belongs. Over the next 2 days I continued my routine exactly as before. I answered calls, reviewed reports, checked in with the office, everything steady, everything consistent. But behind that routine each layer of protection was being put into place, one adjustment at a time, until the structure was no longer accessible in the way it had been, and by Thursday afternoon the system was complete. Not visibly different, not noticeably restricted to anyone who did not understand it deeply, but fully controlled again, every entry point accounted for, every pathway redirected. I sat at my kitchen table that evening with my laptop open in front of me and reviewed the accounts one more time. The same patterns that had once appeared quietly in the background were now absent, not erased, not hidden, simply no longer possible. And that told me everything I needed to know. The access they had relied on was gone. The space they had used no longer existed, and yet nothing had been said, nothing had been confronted, everything remained calm, which meant the next step would reveal itself naturally. Because when something stops working the way it used to, people notice, and when they notice, they respond. I closed my laptop slowly and sat back in my chair, the house quiet around me. The same quiet that had once meant uncertainty now felt different. It felt controlled, intentional, because I had already moved the foundation back into place, and whatever came next would not be a surprise. It would simply be the moment when they realized that what they thought they understood was never actually theirs to manage, only something they had been allowed to approach for a short time. It happened sooner than I expected, not with a confrontation, not with a question, but with a pause, the kind of pause that appears when something no longer works the way it used to. My son called me late Friday afternoon, his voice slightly different this time. Still calm, but carrying a hint of confusion he could not fully hide. He mentioned there had been a small issue while reviewing some account details, something about access not behaving the way he remembered, something about needing clarification. I listened quietly, not interrupting, letting him explain in his own words, because people reveal more when they try to make sense of something they do not understand. He said he might have made a mistake, that perhaps he was looking in the wrong place, and I could hear the uncertainty building beneath his careful tone. I responded simply, that systems evolve over time, that structures are updated when necessary, that it is important to keep things secure as they grow. My words were calm, neutral, offering explanation without revealing intention. There was a brief silence on the line after I spoke, not long, just enough to signal that something had shifted for him. He asked if we could sit down together and review everything properly, make sure he understood how things were organized now, and I agreed without hesitation, because this was always going to be the moment when understanding replaced assumption. We met the next day at my house. The same kitchen table where I had spent years building everything piece by piece. He arrived alone this time, which told me more than anything he could have said. No shared confidence, no quiet reinforcement beside him, just questions he needed answered. He sat across from me and opened his laptop, moving through screens with a focus that was no longer casual. He showed me where he had been looking, where things no longer aligned with what he expected, and I watched calmly, allowing him to walk himself through the realization. Because clarity is stronger when it is reached, not given. After a few minutes he stopped, his hands resting on the keyboard, and looked up at me directly, asking how everything was structured now, how access was managed, what had changed. I held his gaze steadily and explained it in simple terms, not technical, not complicated, just clear. I told him that every part of the business had always been designed with layered control, that access was never ownership, that visibility was never authority, and that over time adjustments had been made to ensure that everything remained exactly where it belonged. He listened carefully. The confidence from earlier conversations no longer present, replaced by something quieter, something more aware. I did not accuse him. I did not mention what I had seen, because this was not about proving anything. It was about establishing reality. I closed the laptop gently and folded my hands on the table, and then I said something I had not needed to say before. I told him that everything he had grown up with, every opportunity, every comfort, every stable moment he had taken for granted, had come from decisions he had never seen, from risks he had never understood, and from work he had never asked about. I told him that I had never needed recognition, but I had always expected respect, not spoken loudly, not demanded, just understood. There was a long silence after that, the kind that does not need to be filled, because it carries its own weight. He nodded slowly, not fully responding, not arguing, just processing what had been said. And in that moment I realized something important. This was not the end of a conflict. It was the correction of a misunderstanding that had gone too far. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the same quiet street, the same steady world I had built for him, and I knew that from this point forward nothing needed to be proven again, because what mattered had already been made clear, not through force, not through anger, but through control. And sometimes that is the only language people finally understand.